Learning is acquired by him who loves God, loves mankind, studies in order to teach, and studies in order to practice.
This is another in our series of programs on philosophies of education. A philosophy of education is a body of ideas and values that guide educational thought and practice. In this program, we shall examine a Jewish philosophy of education.
National Educational Television presents Philosophies of Education, one in a series of 13 programs presenting some of today's leaders in American education, produced by KTCA-TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis. Teaching methods and courses of study in our schools differ greatly. This diversity, while an inherent strength in a free society, may be confusing. Guiding the differing ways of each teacher and school are differing beliefs about such matters as human nature, knowledge, values, and the good society. These comprise different philosophies of education. The purpose of this series is to set forth a representative group of these guiding philosophies. Here is Dr. Harvey M. Rice, president of McAllister College and host of our series.
Judaism is one of the great historic religions of mankind. As a complex system of life and thought, it embraces a wide variety of viewpoints on many subjects, including education. Therefore, there is no single Jewish of education. It is possible, however, to distinguish certain dominant features of the Jewish outlook and to suggest certain consequences of it for teaching and learning. The Jewish community has traditionally given a high place to the teacher or rabbi. Scholarship is honored. Study is encouraged as a religious obligation. Since the Bible and the Talmud are regarded as prime resources for understanding the will of God, meticulous care is given to their reading and interpretation. The Hebrew language and traditional practices are also central elements in the culture thus transmitted. It is significant that in all Western civilization, no people has had as long and continuous a history of deliberate educational concern as the Jews. Let us look now at a quotation, a portion of which you heard earlier on this program. It is taken from the Living Talmud, New American Library, and it will introduce us to certain of the significant principles of a Jewish philosophy of education.
Learning is acquired by him who knows his place, who is content with his portion, who makes a hedge about his work, who takes no credit to himself, who is beloved, who loves God, loves mankind, loves acts of charity, loves reproof, loves rectitude, keeps far from honors, is not puffed up with his learning, does not delight in handing down decisions, bears the yoke along with his fellows, judges him with the scales weighted in his favor, leads him on to the truth, leads him on to peace, concentrates on his study, is capable of intellectual give and take, is capable of adding to what he has learned, studies in order to teach, and studies in order to practice, makes his teacher wiser, is exact in what he has learned, and quotes his source.
We are very happy to have with us as guest on this program a man who has a national reputation in the field of Jewish education, Rabbi Eugene B. Borowitz. Rabbi Borowitz is a graduate of Ohio State University, and he earned doctor's degrees at Hebrew Union College and at Teachers College of Columbia University. He served 2 congregations as rabbi after being ordained in 1948. In 1958, and since that time, Rabbi Borowitz has been National Director of Education for the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Rabbi Borowitz, it's a great pleasure for us to have you with us on this program to share with us your views on a Jewish philosophy of education. I wonder if you wouldn't tell us now what your viewpoint on this subject is.
I'd be delighted to, Dr. Rice. The Jewish view of education is based upon its view of man. If we start with the biblical verse, which says, man is created in the image of God, I think we can understand the Jewish point of view with regard to education. When the Bible said man is created in the image of God, it said that man was not cut off and isolated from the universe, but was part of it. Something in him could reach up to it and understand it. Man may be limited and small, but he can grow toward God because something in him corresponds to God. This is the first source of the Jewish motive and desire for education. But there is a second one as well. Man is not just an animal that can educate himself to be more godlike. He is a creature of history. Other men have learned about God, some of them geniuses. Men like Moses and the prophets have written down their experience in a way that enriches and enlarges ours. Thus, we study not for ourselves, but also we study the records of men who went before, so that we can understand ourselves and our relationship to the universe better. It is from this view of man that the Jewish philosophy of education grows. A man needs to study so that he may become himself. Study is part of his being, of his very existence. It is a religious duty, a commandment. A man who would fulfill himself needs to study and educate himself. I think the important thing to recognize about this is that we are talking about man, not about children. Jewish education thinks of itself largely in terms of what the adult needs. All through Jewish history, we have seen a record of adults studying and learning. Now, to say this means to indicate already that Jewish education as it understands itself proceeds all through one's life. A man grows and changes. His problems grow and change. Perhaps the circumstances in which he finds himself also change. Thus, education is something that goes on a lifelong basis. I think perhaps the most popular picture of a Jew is of an old man bent over a book. That view may be somewhat different from the ordinary view of education, but of course it takes in the education of children as well. Obviously, if we're going to have educated adults, if we're going to have the kind of people who study all their life, we must begin with our children. The Jewish devotion to the education of their children is a time-honored tradition. I think it's one that most people recognize as Jews. Even to this day, when Jews are perhaps not quite as good as they ought to be in following their traditions, the devotion to the education of their children still maintains. But if Jewish education applies to all one's life, whether of one age or another, it is universal to all men as well. A man needs education because he's a man, not because he's old, not because he's young. And therefore, a Jew would not limit education to one group, either the priests or the rabbis, the rich or the lazy. Education should be universal because every man requires it to fulfill himself as man. It's only been in recent years that Jews have carried out this principle with regard to women as well. But today, not only is the Jewish view of education universal for all men, it includes women as well. Now, at one time, this was a personal and a familial responsibility, a responsibility which every parent carried out to his children. I think it's safe to say that that still carries on. But as society has become more complex, as the requirements of education have grown, as long ago as 2,000 years ago, somewhere about the time of Jesus, Jewish education changed from being a private and familial matter alone to becoming a matter in which the community took responsibility. After all, it's not just the family, not just the parent, who wants these children to grow up in a certain way. The community has a stake in their education as well. So the community provided schools, provided scholarships in effect, saw to it that there were academies for higher learning, saw to it that even for the simple man there were study halls where he might go and study. This is a notion then of community responsibility for education, a responsibility which is carried out down to our very own day. This, I would say, is the rounded point of view from which a Jewish point of view with regard to education emerges. The Jew sees education as a continuing task, one which goes on all one's life, one which ought to occupy all people, one which begins from the family but stretches out in the community. Perhaps I can summarize it best in terms of two statements given us by the rabbis. The rabbis of the Talmud said, "An ignorant man cannot be truly pious." And again they said, "Only a man who studies can truly be free." Whether we think of our education today as purely religious education, or the broader sense of what education does to a man, of how it helps him fulfill his potentialities, it is clear that these statements help us make religion and education primary goals of our life. If we would know ourselves and understand ourselves, we must study and we must learn. Education is not a luxury. It is the bread of existence itself.
Rabbi Borowitz, this is certainly a lucid statement concerning your point of view. I wonder, though, if you would let me ask you a few questions. For example, isn't the Jewish point of view regarding education, especially that of dietary observances and frequent recollection of the past and ancient times, aren't these out of keeping with present-day demands and needs?
I think this is a general problem of American life, that we're so eager to rush into the future that we pay no attention to the past. Sometimes we're so eager to be progressive and dynamic and creative, or some of the other wonderful words that we love to use, that we don't know where we're going from to where we're going to. Yes, the Jewish view does think that part of the past is important, but it sees it as a base for moving forward, a direction and a guide as to where we ought to be heading. If one takes a look at contemporary Judaism, or even the Judaism of the classic periods, the biblical and Talmudic times, one finds that Judaism did change and develop, and it can do so today. But at least it has a basis upon which to do so. And I think we need this in America today.
Isn't there a very heavy emphasis upon books and upon intellectualism in Jewish education? Don't you feel that this perhaps places you in a position to be unable to learn from actual experience?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to consider what those books were. Most of the books out of which Jews studied were books of law. There were books which had to deal with life, with the actual situations in which people found themselves. Now, there's no objection in Jewish education to using other instruments of education. After all, it isn't so long ago that everyone was studying from books because there was nothing else to study from. Movies and films and slides and the kind of life situations we talk about today has been a rather new innovation. I see nothing in the Jewish view of education which would object to using them. But there's a place for books too, particularly the great books and the classic books. I think one of the major troubles of our education today is our difficulty in having people who know the classic books and who have read them. I think we might have less objection to education in our own time if we had more people who had read the great classics. And in this position, I think that the Jews would say that knowing and understanding and studying the great books ought to be an integral part of our education.
But isn't it possible that the strong and perhaps increasing identification of some Jews with the Jewish religious community introduces a divisive kind of influence in the education of young people?
I don't think that religion really serves such a function. Even a religion which is a community religion, such as Judaism is, one which is lived in homes and community affairs as much as it is lived inside the synagogue. I think that perhaps most divisiveness comes from the attitudes people have toward one another. If one looks at what Protestantism or Catholicism, and certainly Judaism, has to say about getting along with one's neighbor, religion becomes a means of sending the individual out to meet his fellow man, to have intercourse with him in a way that benefits them all. It's not the teaching of the Jewish religion or its community activities which brings about divisiveness, but rather the attitudes that people have toward one another for reasons which are irreligious. It seems to me that what we require in America, and what education requires as well, are strong religious roots, the kind of belief in our own faith, which will want us to move forward to see our fellow man as a creature of God. Perhaps I can summarize it best in that great rule which is contained in the book of Leviticus, which was quoted so approvingly by Jesus, namely, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." But this is what faith in Judaism teaches. That's not divisiveness, but the real basis for democracy.
Well, you have indicated that to the Jew, education of all people is a community responsibility. Certainly this has been followed in your support as a community of public schools. And at the same time, you have fought vigorously to prevent introduction of any religious teachings into the public schools. Isn't this inconsistent with your other position?
Well, it seems a little troublesome at first, I must admit. But I think the essential question here is what keeps a religion. Would it be helpful and beneficial to religion if the public schools were involved in its teaching? Now, I would say that the Jewish people is perhaps an expert in this question of what keeps a religion alive. We've been a rather small minority for 2,000 years scattered among the peoples of the world. We know pretty well what can and what can't keep a religion meaningful and active in the hearts of its people. If we had to place our emphasis, we would say that what keeps a religion strong and vigorous are the homes and the synagogues of its community. Therefore, from our point of view, the emphasis ought to be placed where it belongs, seeing to it that religion is alive in the hearts of its people. To introduce religion into the public schools would serve to bring divisiveness into what has been one of the great unifying forces of our democracy. A child is educated in the United States not because he's a Catholic, Protestant, or Jew. He's educated because he's a child of our country. To introduce religious teaching into the school would inevitably divide one group from another and take what has brought us together and make of it an instrument that would divide us one from another. Besides, has the American principle of the separation of church and state harmed or helped religion? Now, as we see it, religion is stronger and has more active influence in the lives of individuals and our community in the United States than it has almost anywhere else in the world. Separating church and state has given a kind of healthy competitive spirit to religion, the kind of competitive spirit which has made religion grow and prosper. I don't think we Jews, even though we are a small minority, are afraid of the kind of challenge which the American system has given to us. And we would want to emphasize in our homes and our synagogues what it is that we care about. But I think we would have to pray and hope and work to see to it that the public schools, as our major bastion of democracy, would always remain free from the teaching of religion, any religion.
Rabbi Borowitz, let's look in on a scene in a Jewish home on Friday evening. Does this show any of the points of view you have been talking about?
These Sabbath candles were lighted just before sundown by the mother of this Jewish family. It is dinner time on a Friday night. The father is just concluding the singing of the Kiddush. With love and favor thou hast given us thy holy Sabbath as an inheritance. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who sanctifiest the Sabbath day. In many modern busy Jewish homes, this may be the only meal the family eats together all week. This is the time the father traditionally asks what the children have learned in school. He may even quiz them a little. Respect for learning is one of the cornerstones of the Jewish home, and it is enhanced in a family atmosphere such as this one. Friday night is the time for recounting the triumphs of the classroom. Joel's A in spelling, Ruthie's French paper which drew praise from the teacher. Both are applauded in the family circle. The children of this family, like many other American Jewish children, attend Hebrew classes after public school hours. Father's questions at the Friday dinner table indicate his interest in this area of their education as well. The young man of the house seems to have a question, something in his Bible study that he didn't quite understand at Hebrew school. He knows that this is the time he can count on his father's unhurried and undivided attention. He knows, too, that father enjoys his role as a sort of supplementary teacher. Mother doesn't mind the interruption of dinner. She is proud that her young son has asked an intelligent question, and proud that her husband can answer it. Dinner will wait, but whoever teaches his son teaches not alone his son, but also his son's son, and so on to the end of all generations. So it was written in the Gemara.
Rabbi Borowitz, what do you think of that?
Well, I must admit, I wish that every Jewish home were like that. Unfortunately, in our own day, a number at least aren't doing this sort of thing. But I think it captures the heart and the spirit of the Jewish tradition with regard to education. The little boy bringing his book to his father. He knows that his father will be interested, that his mother will be looking on approvingly. The father who cares, who wants the child to come with his book, who doesn't mind being cast into the role of a teacher, even though he knows that sometime he may not be able to answer the questions. There's a family spirit and attitude here toward education that's quite dear to us, and one that will make education quite dear in the life of that child. This home really revolves around education, doesn't it? It's something that is part of the growing up of the child. It's something that's part of the relationship between the father and the mother. And there's no confusion here between what needs to be done at school and what needs to be done at home. The father can't teach his child everything, nor can the mother. They want this child to go to school. They want him to have a good school. They want his teachers to be equipped and encouraged to be even better equipped to teach that child. But the home is the motive force and the power. Here is where the educational drive, the context, the goal is given. This is something very precious to us, and I think it would illuminate the entire American educational system if it were carried out throughout our country.
So perhaps you would give us some suggestions then as to how parents, teachers, citizens generally could introduce more of your point of view into the schools.
Well, what I think I have to say is not just a religious point of view that a Jew alone would hold. I think it says something about education that would appeal to every citizen. It says something about the way each American adult ought to look at education. Education is part of his life, part of his way of becoming what he might be, of what he has in potential. Self-fulfillment is the great American aim, and it's an aim which would strengthen our democracy. When parents and teachers, when every citizen in this country recognizes what education can mean to him, then education will mean more to our children and will in fact become part of the fabric of our democracy. But more than that, our institutions, our tax problems, our school building difficulties, our standards for teachers and classes would improve if each of us saw education as part of our way of living. Success in education is really part of being a successful American human being. Now, to say that is not to feel that education must be limited to the school system alone. Schools can do their part. Even in the teaching of some of the goals that religion holds dear, in teaching of moral and ethical values, schools can do a great deal. The relationship between teacher and student, the attitudes which are passed on between superintendents and members of their staffs, the way in which the public looks at education, all of these can create a moral and even a spiritual atmosphere in which a child can grow in the way that religion would want him to. And yet none of this is doctrinal. None of this is teaching religion in the formal sense, yet it cooperates toward the goals that religion wants. The teaching of religion itself, which would integrate and unite these all together, would again be something springing from the hearts and homes of our American society. Therefore, I think if anything should stand out of all this, it is a call, indeed a cry to all Americans, to understand what education is and means to them. Education is not just a matter of books, nor a matter of schools, elementary, junior high, or even of our great universities and colleges. Education is a matter fundamental to the life of the human being. And insofar as democracy is concerned with human beings, education is fundamental and essential in the life of our democracy as well. It is to this that a Jewish view of education would summon us all.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Borowitz, for this very splendid statement, for these interesting comments and outstanding discussion of your point of view. In this program, we have presented a discussion of a Jewish philosophy of education. Philosophies of education are bodies of ideas and ideals that serve as guides for educational thought and practice. We hope you will be with us next week when we present another in this series of programs.
National Educational Television has presented another program in the series Philosophies of Education, produced by KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.
This is National Educational Television.